health-related information on the following show provides general information only. Content presented on any show by any host or guest should not be substituted for a doctor's advice. Always consult your physician before beginning any new diet, exercise, or treatment program.
Welcome to the Accelerated Health TV and radio show. I'm your host, Sara Banta. I'm a wife, a busy mom of three, and the founder of the cutting-edge supplement brand, Accelerated Health Products. This podcast is more than just a source of information. It's a community for you and for those looking to optimize their health. And I release new episodes every Monday and Tuesday live, and a bonus one on Thursdays, and maybe a fourth as well. So remember to subscribe and add to your playlist so you never miss a show. And join my free group coaching on Telegram. There's no downside. I answer your questions. I post on a daily basis, and the details can be found on my website, sarabantahealth.com. My goal, and I need your help, is to reach everyone who needs me with my message of healing. Help me with this goal. Share this podcast with a few of your friends and loved ones, and together we can empower each other on our journey to optimal health. Oh my goodness, today I feel like we're with celebrities, two people that don't even need an introduction. Number one is Dr. Robert Lustig. He is a professor of pediatrics in the Division of Endocrinology and member of the Institute for Health Policy Studies at UCSF. He is a major factor in the force against processed foods and fructose. And with him, we've got Dr. Richard Johnson. He's a professor of medicine at the University of Colorado and is a clinician, educator, and researcher. And he has brought to the forefront this thing called uric acid. Welcome, both of you. How are you today?
Wonderful.
I'm great. And yes, we're all going to want to speak. We have so much to say, the three of us. So it's going to be a fun conversation. Before we came on, I mentioned the fact that we've got all of these vegans, the vegetarians, the paleo, the carnivores, the keto, all of these different mantras, right? And it's a person's identity. I'm a vegan. I can't touch butter. But really, everyone's goal is to increase energy, increase mitochondrial health, increase ATP. And if you were to ask me, the number one detriment to our mitochondrial health is our food supply. It has been hijacked, and ultra processed foods is the number one cause. So Robert, why don't you start out and explain what constitutes ultra processed foods, because there are low carb, protein bar processed foods, right? What is an ultra processed food?
Well, it depends on who you ask as to what the definition is. We're sort of settling around the definition created by Dr. Carlos Monteiro, who is a professor of epidemiology and public health at the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil. And the reason is because he's actually gathered the data. So he's actually looked at consumption patterns around the world and broken the various food groups and foods consumed into 4 classes. So this is called the NOVA system, and there are 4 classes to the NOVA system, 1 through 4. The easiest way to explain it to your audience would be with an example. So let's take an apple. So NOVA class 1 would be an apple picked off a tree. NOVA class 2 would be apple slices, destemmed, seeded, maybe deskinned. NOVA class 3 would be apple sauce, so cooked, processed, macerated, possibly with a preservative, maybe even added sugar. And finally, NOVA class 4 would be a McDonald's apple pie. And so the question is there any actual NOVA class 1 apple in that NOVA class 4 McDonald's apple pie? And only McDonald's knows for sure. But what is very clear is that it is the NOVA class 4 grouping, which happens to constitute 73% of the American grocery store. that has been associated with all of the chronic metabolic diseases that we are dealing with today. So, obesity, type 2 diabetes, hypertension, dyslipidemia, cardiovascular disease, cancer, fatty liver disease, polycystic ovarian disease. Nova Class 4 tracks with all of those, whereas Nova Class 1 through 3 generates almost no signal at all. So, that's one way to do it. How can you determine whether any specific food is Class 1, 2, 3, or 4? Well, we've developed an app to help you do that. You can go online and go to something called Perfect. So it's PERFACT.co. And there is a Nova filter. So you can actually filter out all of the Nova Class 4 items in your grocery store so that you can only buy the metabolically healthy ones. Unfortunately, if you do that, you've lost 75% of your grocery store, which of course is the right thing to do.
Exactly.
I like your definition, and I may have to get that app. But for me, the simple answer is you get something that has a wrapper, you take it off, it tastes really, really good, and you can taste the salt and the sweet and all the crap. And that is ultra processed food, and at least to me. But I have to say that your answer was really elegant. I just kind of there's so many processed foods that and the two major things that they love to inject the foods with or to put it in there is like salt, sugar, and fats. But it's really the salt and the sugar that are really the key elements that seem to be bad. I mean, there are a lot of elements, but those are like have to be your top two.
Right. And salt, when we talk about salt, you can't clump all salts together. A full complete salt that has all 62 minerals in it, the body needs that. But what you're talking about is the refined sodium that is power punched into that ultra processed food combined with the added refined sugars. And you have like this explosion bomb of dopamine in your brain that causes the overeating. And the one thing that we got to realize is that we know people are not trying to get fat or trying to get sick. We know that it's not about willpower, because if that was the case, then we would have had obesity 100 years ago. And we didn't. You go look at the old movies, no one's fat. And so it's not like all of a sudden that this generation has no willpower. So what is it that is making people feel so bad about themselves because they can't control their intake with these processed foods?
So this is a little complicated, and I'll try to make it as simple as possible. Everybody thinks that obesity is about gluttony and sloth. They say we eat too much, we exercise too little. Actually, the data, when you actually look at the data, does not say that. Over the last 20 years, caloric intake is actually stabilized. It's actually consistently across the board. It's not going up. When you look at activity, it's actually increasing, not decreasing. We have the data on that as well. So this notion that our obesity is related to our behavior is actually not supported by the literature, by the medical data that's available. Well, if that's not the case, then what is the reason? Now, there are different models for obesity. There's what we call the energy balance model. That is calories, that is gluttony and sloth. Just talked about that one and how it's not right. There's another model called the carbohydrate insulin model. And I think both Rick and I have, delved into this pretty, severely over the years. That basically refined carbohydrate, that is glucose and fructose, drive insulin release and also insulin resistance. And that insulin is actually driving adipose tissue development and therefore weight gain. And that it's not what you eat, it's not how much you eat, but rather what you eat. It's not the quantity of the food, but rather the quality of the food that counts. But neither of those two models explain why we have obese newborns. And neither of those two models explain why every country is getting obese, no matter where they are. So something else is going on. Recently, we published a paper, and Rick's very familiar with it, in the International Journal of Obesity, where we provided a new model. And it's called the redox model, oxidation reduction model, which has to do with whether or not specific compounds in our environment, which include food, but also include air, which also include water, include all of these chemicals that we are exposed to on a daily basis, like, for instance, PFAS and BPA and chlorpyrifos and phthalates and PBDE and parabens, and the list goes on and on. Whether these might actually be uniquely obesogenic because they increase oxidative stress within the cell. And this actually seems to conform to the majority of the causes of obesity. Just so happens food is one of those obesogens because it generates more obesity than its calories, ultra-processed food does. So that's what I would say. Ultimately, of those various things that I just talked about, the food is the easiest one to fix. So that's why I spend most of my time there.
Yeah, let me add to that. So I totally agree that, when you look at what is associated with obesity, it's when it's really obesity tends to be a low energy state. Inside the cells, there's not enough ATP, and ATP is the main energy that is produced by the mitochondria. And if you look at that, you'll find that the mitochondria are suppressed. And if I biopsy the muscle of a person who's very overweight, the ATP levels will be low. If I biopsy the liver in a person with fatty liver, the ATP levels are low. Whereas, when we eat most healthy foods, they're there to raise your energy, not to suppress the energy. And when you look at the mechanism for the suppression, and we've done this, it's exactly as Rob says. There is oxidative stress going on in the mitochondria, and the oxidative stress blocks the ATP production. And so ultimately, the problem is mitochondrial oxidative stress. Now, interestingly, fructose is the main nutrient that lowers ATP in the cell, and it does it by inducing oxidative stress through the mitochondria. And it involves this uric acid that I write about, and David Perlmutter writes about. And fructose generates uric acid. Actually, Rob reported this very early on. And the uric acid itself isn't the cause of the oxidative stress, but it brings in enzymes that make oxidants into the mitochondria to activate this pathway. Now, toxins can also cause oxidative stress to the mitochondria, just as Rob said. And recently, we published a paper showing that particulate matter in the air from burning sugarcane fields, and sugar is the culprit again, but indirectly this time. But the sugarcane, when you burn it, you get this ash. The ash is filled with these silica nanoparticles. And when you breathe that, you actually suppress your mitochondria through this same mechanism. But we think that the main source is from fructose. And one of the things that our group did recently was to show that it isn't just the fructose we eat. We can make fructose, and we make fructose from carbs. So it comes back to the importance of low carb diets. And, and most of these diets, like the paleo diets and so forth, are, emphasize low sugar, low high glycemic diet type foods. Even vegan diets often say, cut back on sugar, cut back on the high glycemic carbs. And it's those high glycemic carbs that are particularly good at being converted to fructose in the body. And salt turns out to be a way to activate that process of converting the carbs, the glucose, to fructose. So if you're taking, if you're on salt, but you're on a low carb diet, it's not going to be an issue. But if you're on a high carb diet, then the salted French fries, for example, is worse than regular potatoes without the salt and grease on it. Anyway, I'm sorry to take up so much time, but I'm in agreement with Rob that the problem is the mitochondria. And that's actually what you said too.
Yes, and one thing I want to really emphasize is it's not just the food diet that we're taking in, what you're talking about, Rob, the toxins, the air, the radiation. We know that without eating a calorie, just being exposed to radiation will cause insulin resistance. And tell me if this is explaining it correctly, where your cells are so overstuffed with toxins and radiation or all of the things that you mentioned. And here we have glucose and insulin trying to get the glucose into the cell. And the cell says, nope, I'm full. I'm not going to take any more in. So all of that stuff is going to make this insulin resistance even that much worse.
Well, so what you've described is insulin resistance. That's usually insulin resistance at the level of the muscle. That's not necessarily insulin resistance at the level of the adipose tissue, or insulin resistance at the level of the liver, or insulin resistance at the level of the brain, which Rick has written about extensively. Every tissue has a differential insulin sensitivity. Every tissue responds to insulin differently. And every tissue has its own brand of insulin resistance. So when you have insulin resistance of the heart, you have something called congestive cardiomyopathy. When you have insulin resistance of the pancreas, you have this thing called type 2 diabetes. When you have insulin resistance of the liver, you have this thing called fatty liver disease. When you have insulin resistance of the ovary, you have polycystic ovarian disease. When you have insulin resistance of the brain, you have something called Alzheimer's disease. The fact of the matter is, all of these diseases are going up ad nauseum, ad infinitum, in every developed and now developing society. So the question is, what changed? And the answer is, well, a few things changed, but the thing that really changed was the food.
The processed food. And you're saying that it was around 1980 when processed food really took a jump?
In the mid 70s, I would say, it was what the advent of high fructose corn syrup into our diet was in 1975. By 1985, the process was complete. The reason was because of something that happened in 1980 called Hurricane Allen, which wiped out the entire Caribbean sugar crop. And so the entire food industry went scurrying, trying to figure out what are they going to do to have a homegrown, cheaper alternative to sugarcane. And that's when high fructose corn syrup started being added to Coca-Cola, with the process completing back in 1985 with the, new Coke, which you may or may not remember. I don't know how old you are, but
48.
we revolted, and new Coke went by the wayside, and they brought back classic Coke. Well, you know what? There is no more classic Coke. They just basically changed it to Coke, and snuck the high fructose corn syrup in under the wire, and that's where we are today.
I would like to add to that and just say that, if you go back and look at the epidemic of obesity and diabetes, you'll see that the earliest evidence of it really beginning is back in the 1890s, and it correlates with sugar intake. And sugar intake, as it started going up, you start seeing this parallel rise in obesity, diabetes, heart disease, all the different conditions. And there's even sugar is related to cancers, and you can see some increases in cancers associated with obesity and sugar intake. And it was a gradual increase throughout the 1900s till that 1975, 1980 period when high fructose corn syrup was added. And high fructose corn syrup is fructose and glucose mixed together, with the fructose generally being a little higher than the glucose, whereas table sugar is fructose and glucose bound together in a 1-to-1 relationship. So when you eat a gram or 5 grams of high fructose corn syrup, you typically get more fructose than you would with 5 grams of sugar, but both of them give you a fair amount of fructose. And there's pretty good data that when the high fructose corn syrup was introduced, that total sugars, added sugars, started going up, because it wasn't like regular sugar intake went way down as high fructose corn syrup went up. Maybe during those few years, yes, but in general, what we see is that the total intake of added sugars started really going up around 1980. And that means high fructose corn syrup and table sugars. So we think of both of them as not as bad. Interestingly, when I compare high fructose corn syrup to regular sugar in animal models, high fructose corn syrup is generally a little worse. And we can talk about why that is. It's partly because of the higher fructose content, but it also gets absorbed differently because table sugar has to be broken up once you eat it into fructose and glucose. So there's a little bit of a delay in splitting the fructose and glucose. Whereas when you drink high fructose corn syrup, they both hit the system very quickly.
The other issue that we have to throw on top of that is the fact that high fructose corn syrup is a solution. Sucrose is a crystal.
Right.
And you can only add so much sugar to something before it crystallizes.
Right.
All right. This is why Chips Ahoy cookies tasted gritty in the old days, because they would try to plow as much sugar as they could into the Chips Ahoy cookies. Okay. But then when they would bake them, when they would cool, they would crystallize. And so there was a limit to how much they could put in. Well, then with high fructose corn syrup, because it's miscible, because it's already in solution, because it's a monosaccharide, two monosaccharides rather than a disaccharide, okay, it's already in solution. They found that they could add more. And in doing so, they didn't get the crystallization problem. And then they realized that the more they added, the more people bought, because fructose is addictive. And so that really sort of started the race to the top in terms of how much sugar can we put in the American diet. And that's the thing that just skyrocketed things. And that happened in the 1980s. And now, of course, we're suffering the aftermath of that.
And there's another trick that they did, and that is with the high fructose corn syrup, they could add a lot more, but they could also add very little amounts and mix it into foods where it was just so subtle that, but if you like wheat thins and things like this, which have high fructose corn syrup, and you don't really think that there's sugar in there, right? Or high fructose corn syrup, you wouldn't. But if you just carefully taste it, you can say, oh my, it is a little sweet. And one of the things our work did is we took animals that could not taste sugar. Okay, we genetically altered them so they had no taste, and they still are addicted to sugar. So even when you don't taste sugar, you will be addicted. You can get addicted to it, and they become obese, and they search out. You can have two things of water, and one has sugar in it, and one does not, or high fructose corn syrup, and the mouse will be able to identify and still seek out that water that has a high fructose corn syrup, even if it can't taste it, and it will get fat. And so this is the problem. I mean, is that, if you put a little bit of sugar in the food where you can't really taste it, your body can still sense it. Your brain senses it and gets this kind of craving. So you end up eating these foods that have subtle amounts of sugar, and you eat more and more, and over time, of course, you get a big sugar load. It's a trick.
So we know that 37% of the added sugar in our diet comes from soft drinks. 16% comes from candy, cakes, ice cream, things that we normally identify as dessert. That means that a full 49% of the added sugar in our diet comes from stuff we didn't know had, like salad dressing, like barbecue sauce, like hamburger buns, like hamburger meat. Okay.
Yes. And so the processed food industry realizes that they can put small amounts of sugar in or add a little bit more, and it makes it particularly tasty. Like the ketchup in McDonald's is a little sweeter than than regular ketchup. And that attracts kids and go, oh, I love the ketchup taste. And so you can do the processed foods. They want you to buy it rather than make your own hamburger. And so they will put, a little bit extra sugar, a little extra salt to specifically draw you in to buy that stuff. We're being a tag team, Rob.
It's very simple, Sarah. Fructose is addictive, and we're trying desperately to get the FDA and the WHO to understand that, because if they understand that, then food policy could potentially change.
Because the reality is no one is binging on a ribeye steak, right? That's not what is happening. And Rob, I've heard you talk about the fact that, okay, squeeze 5 oranges, have some orange juice, and then you're asking for breakfast, eat 5 oranges and you want to throw up, right? Because of the fiber. So you're taking out the fiber. So you can pack those calories and the sweetness and the salt bomb for your brain to become addicted in a lot less. So you don't become physically full as quickly. And so and to touch on the meat thing, it was funny. I actually got a package of Wagyu premium hot dogs, and I look at the ingredients, and there is high fructose corn syrup. And here I am eating meat, and they're putting it in that food because it's hitting the gut, telling the brain, I want more. And so it's more of an overconsumption process too. It's like making the problem exponentially worse. And what I want to get into also is, because I've got 3 kids that are athletes, and I just was at a collegiate race, and you've got these big women that are super strong, and they just finished their race, and they're pulling out their Rice Krispie treats. I'm no joke. And these are elite athletes. And I'm thinking, does anyone teach them anything? But in that case, those girls are really looking for energy. That's the purpose of food, right? And we're talking about ATP as true cellular energy. But we have also talked about the fact that processed foods and high fructose corn syrup steals ATP from the body, right?
All right. I have a very simple question for you. Who won the Patriots Day Marathon yesterday?
No idea.
2 Ethiopians. Okay. The question is, do they eat sugar? Not a bit. Not a bit.
Very well said.
They have more energy than you, Sarah, who are clearly athletic, and your kids, and Rick and I all put together will ever have, and they don't eat sugar. In fact, a lot of NBA stars now are sugarless.
Yes.
And the reason is because they've learned that they actually run better on ketones than they do on glucose. And one of the reasons is because they've learned that sugar decreases mitochondrial ATP generation. And there's 3 enzymes. There are 3 enzymes that fructose specifically inhibits. One is AMP kinase, the fuel gauge on the liver cell. Number 2, ACAD-L, acyl-CoA dehydrogenase long chain, which is necessary to cleave fats into 2 carbon fragments so they can be burned by mitochondria. And finally, CPT1A, which is the enzyme that generates carnitine, which is necessary to shuttle the fats into the mitochondria for burning in the first place. Bottom line, fructose is a irreversible mitochondrial toxin.
Yeah, and Rob.
So adding sugar to something because you think that that's going to give you energy is actually a fallacy.
Yeah, and I'll add, it also inhibits an enzyme called aconitase in the Krebs cycle and enol-CoA hydratase in the beta fatty acid cycle. I'm sure no one really wants to know that. But bottom line is, fructose absolutely inhibits mitochondrial function. Now, what makes it, this kind of interesting dilemma is, you can say, well, why is it that these super athletes can eat Rice Krispies and still win contests? And the issue is that, there was this myth that your mitochondria of these super athletes is immune to sugar. That's not true. But what is true is that the mitochondria of super athletes are usually incredible. They're producing huge amounts of ATP. And so they can eat a little bit of fructose and reduce their ATP and still be making a huge amount of ATP and still outrun you. Yeah, for sure. But if they keep doing it, they will eventually, reduce their mitochondrial ATP and get into trouble. And if they want to win contests, you don't want to, even if you're a super athlete, you don't want to reduce your mitochondrial function by 5% because you're up against other people with the same kind of mitochondria. So
that is a question in my house a lot, where my husband will say, Sarah, if it's so bad for you, then why are all these athletes eating all of that sugar? Well, those athletes were the guys that won AYSO soccer in kindergarten and blew everyone away because of their genetics that have carried them a little further. And they have, and maybe the mitochondrial failure is going to maybe show up more as a brain fog in their 40s, or hair loss, or vitiligo, or cancer. And it's not showing up as a lack of athleticism in the current day. So, nothing's for free, right?
So the sports drink companies added fructose specifically to energy drinks. The original Gatorade, invented and patented in 1965 by Dr. Robert Cade at the University of Florida, where Rick used to work. So he knows more about this than I do, but I'm on the train right now, so let me finish. Okay. What was that original Gatorade? It was glucose, it was sodium, and it was water. It was basically an oral rehydration solution, the same thing we give to cholera victims in India in order to get water transport across the intestinal brush border in order to maintain plasma volume, because if you were dehydrated, that reduced your performance. Did you ever taste the original Gatorade, Sarah?
I don't think I'm old enough.
It tasted like tiger piss. It tasted awful. It had glucose. It tasted horrible. Okay. Nobody but an elite athlete dehydrated on the gridiron would ever touch this stuff. Okay.
Yeah,
that was Oakley's Gatorade. In 1992, Pepsi buys Gatorade, says, how are we going to market this swill? So what they do, they did two things: Michael Jordan and high fructose corn syrup. And now, who's drinking the Gatorade? The fat kids.
Right.
Yeah. The original Gatorade, Jesse said, tasted so bad that when Bob Cade tried it out on the football players, the first guy spit it out, and the second guy took it and said, he says, I know how to use it. And he poured it over his head. And then Cade said, well, at least I'm helping him cool off. But yeah, yes. So one of the problems is when people are young and athletic, they can look like they can tolerate a Coke easily, and they sort of do. They can run on the beach, and the companies know this, so that when the sugar companies, soft drink companies, they show some young thin person drinking a soft drink, but and if you have really good mitochondrial function, you won't show as much of a biologic effect from the fructose because your mitochondria are still making a lot of ATP. But over time, you lose that ability. And when the ATP levels start getting low, that triggers hunger, that triggers overeating, that triggers leptin resistance, that triggers fat in the, putting fat in your tissues, in your liver, in your blood. It triggers insulin resistance in the brain. Yeah, all those bad things come out of it, but it takes a while. I mean, it's not like an immediate thing when you're young and athletic.
Right. Well, Rick, you've talked about the survival switch, and this is something that I actually talk to a lot about, because it's not just the processed foods that's a major factor, but the radiation and the other toxins where your body's under threat and it doesn't know if we're going to hit a famine, if we're being chased by a tiger, if we fought with our husband, it doesn't care what the stressor is, but it shuts down the mechanism, shuts down the metabolism, the thyroid health, and all of these things. So can you explain what is going on in that survival switch?
Okay, well, I mean, sure. Very, very briefly, we were interested in why animals, will suddenly like gain weight before winter or gain weight before they go on long distance migrations. And we realized that what they were actually doing was that they were triggering fructose production, which then triggers this drop in ATP, which then stimulates them to forage for food and all those things. And when we looked at what the trigger was, it's the activation of a pathway called the polyol pathway, which converts glucose to fructose. And that polyol pathway can be activated by sugar. It can be activated by very high salt concentrations. It can be activated by stress, emotional stress. It can be activated by low oxygen. If you, like climbing a mountain and you can activate it when the oxygen levels are low. It can be activated by a fall in blood pressure. So any kind of stressful setting can actually trigger this switch. And so I think that although our work is focused on kind of things like changes in hydration and things like that, but emotional stress can also activate this pathway. So yeah, I think that there is this switch that is triggered by stress. That could be toxins that could then help. It says to the animal, hey, you're under pressure. You need to like start going into a fat storage mode in case things get worse. And so, yes, I think that this is an important pathway.
And I would think that the ultra processed foods, when you're eating those foods and your body's saying, I'm not getting the nutrients I want, that there's a threat there too. And there's this underlying stress, like, okay, what am I going to do for real fuel? Where are my amino acids? Where are my healthy fats, right? So that's part of the equation.
I don't know if we know yet. I don't know if we know that yet. That is a hypothesis. I'm not.
Absolutely.
It's not. I'm waiting to see data that actually supports that that notion that in fact it's a triage phenomenon. That is that we're not getting enough protein, we're not getting enough micronutrients, we're not getting enough, so we have to eat more of everything. That is an hypothesis, and it absolutely needs to be tested.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And I should say that our switch looks very real in the, we've done it in laboratory animals, but it still has, some hypothesis components to it that need to be fully tested in humans, but it does look very real.
So we know that at least 93% of the population, or at least the United States, is metabolically inflexible. We are obese, we're overstuffed. So we have all of this energy walking around on our bodies, but we can't tap into it. We are exhausted. Our thyroid health is plummeted. We are fatigued, or we have brain fog. How do you suggest someone listening who I just explained, what do they do? What do they do to now become metabolically flexible, turn this around?
Well, so the goal is to be able to use glucose or fat. That's called metabolic flexibility, when you can do both. Well, if your insulin is high, you can't use fat. In fact, ultimately, you can't use glucose either. And that's when you get type 2 diabetes. Ultimately, what we need to do is we need to get the insulin down any way you can, because everybody's insulin is up. And, the data, the secular trend data over the last 40 years demonstrates that we are now producing 2 to 4 times the amount of insulin to maintain our serum glucose than we did back in the 1970s. They said, until we solve the insulin problem, we will not solve the metabolic health problem. Gotta get the insulin down. Okay, how do you do that? Well, let's start with the easy things. How do you keep insulin down? Don't let it go up. What makes it go up? Refined carbohydrate and sugar. Start there. That's where I suggest, to my patients, as a public health advocate, that's where you start. Now, does that mean you have to go to a ketogenic diet? No. Turns out a high fiber diet will do as well at mitigating the glucose excursions as does a ketogenic diet. But you have to eat the fiber. The problem is ultra-processed food is fiberless food. So every which way, either because of the refined carbohydrate and sugar content of the ultra-processed food, or because of the lack of fiber of ultra-processed food. Ultra-processed food's the problem every which way you go. Get rid of the ultra-processed food, see how you feel, and go from there. That's step one. After that, there are a bunch of other steps you can do to try to, shall we say, pit both ends against the middle.
Yeah, and I totally would like to echo what Rob's saying. I think that the trick is to make the mitochondria healthy. When you make the mitochondria healthy, you'll also cure insulin resistance. And when the mitochondria are healthy, then you can burn fat and you can burn carbs at the same time. So the goal is that, and everything he said. The first step is to reduce damaging the mitochondria, reduce causing the insulin resistance by cutting back on carbs, especially high glycemic carbs and sugar and high fructose corn syrup. And then the second thing, there's some very good fats. Picking omega-3 fats are really great. Another one is to stay well hydrated. Hydration is so important. Exercise is absolutely critical. And, especially if you do, kind of like this stage 2 exercise where you're kind of like walking or jogging at a low rate where you can maintain it for 30, 40 minutes and, still be able to, talk. That actually stimulates mitochondrial biogenesis and mitochondrial regeneration. There's certain foods that may actually help, insulin resistance. So there's some data that coffee is good, for example, dark chocolate.
Dark chocolate, very dark.
Very dark. It has to be, epicatechin rich. You don't want a lot of sugar in there. That's for sure. You're countering it. And you don't want sugar in the coffee either.
Right.
Believe it or not, natural fruits, even though we talk about fructose being bad, small amounts of natural fruits are really quite good. Like kiwi is kind of low in sugar, low in fructose, high in vitamin C. Vitamin C actually is a good antioxidant, helps the mitochondria. There's a lot of eating healthy, unprocessed foods, normal. Those are going to be really, really good. There's, I just started working with a company that markets allulose, which is a low-calorie sugar, natural sugar that seems to have a glucose-lowering effect, especially postprandial. I think that's probably beneficial. But I'm working for them now, so disclosure. But I do. The data looks very strong. But the main thing is eat healthy. High protein is good. It's satiating. A paleo diet is really a low carb diet, and they're very similar. A vegan diet, you got to be careful about the breads and stuff like that. Or
don't forget, both Doritos and Oreos are all vegan.
Right.
Yeah, you don't want to eat those. Yeah, exactly. So you can eat a healthy. If you're a vegetarian, you can eat a healthy vegetarian diet. You don't have to be, eat a carnivore diet. But you got to be very careful because it's the carbs that kill, really. And it's especially the high glycemic carbs and the sugar containing high fructose corn. high fructose corn syrup containing carbs. Those are the number 1 and 2 causes of the obesity epidemic. And all these other things are important too. So.
Once upon a time, there was a poison worse than fructose. It was called trans fats. But we learned that. It only took 55 years for the FDA to actually remove trans fats from our diet. Okay, that's all. Just 55 years. So now the big kahuna is sugar. Sugar is the number 1 public enemy because of these effects. The effects on de novo lipogenesis, making fat because of altering ATP generation. Number 2, glycation, this oxidative stress that we've been talking about, where glucose or fructose binds to proteins and generates hydrogen peroxides in the cell, which damage the cell. And finally, most importantly, the addiction piece.
Yeah.
Okay.
Everyone should read that Metabolical, your book.
Yes,
really
and that brings me to
things.
the point that I can't believe we are out of time with the two of you. I knew this was going to happen. I knew we could go for 4 hours if we wanted. So before we go, I just want to say, after this podcast, I'm taking my dogs for a walk to lower my cortisol and my blood sugar. I'm going to focus on my protein. I'm going to fill in with whole low sugar fruits and the foods that I've put together in my accelerated food guide that helps, but get rid of the processed foods, right? That is the number 1. Yes, a Coca-Cola is vegan. That's not healthy. A margarita is vegan. That's not healthy. So you got to make smart choices and really think, am I feeling good? Do I have energy? That's a clue. Your body, you don't need to go to the doctor to figure out if you're sick. Just think to yourself, how do I feel?
Because calorie passes your lips doesn't mean that calorie turns into ATP in the body.
Exactly.
That's the key to the issue. Okay. Alcohol is calories, but alcohol is not food. Trans fats are calories, but trans fats are not food. Well, guess what? Sugar is calories, but sugar is not food.
Yeah.
As Jack LaLanne said, the only good thing about a donut is the hole.
I love it. Well, before we go, Rob and Rick, can you please tell us?
Thank you, Rob.
This is an essential read for all of you people out there. Nature wants us to be fat, okay? And you want to be like the carrot on the left, not the right.
Exactly.
Yes, and I've read it multiple times with a highlighter. And Rob, what about your book as well, Metabolic?
Okay. Well, it's over here. It's called Metabolical: The Lure and the Lies of Processed Food, Nutrition, and Modern Medicine. All I can say is that if a product that you buy at the store has a health claim on the front, okay, it's the opposite.
Just like Cheerios could lower cholesterol, right? I remember seeing that. So thank you both so much. This has been amazing and would love to do it again because we have so much to talk about. And thanks everyone else for joining us today. If you need my help or you have questions about where to start with what we just talked about, you can feel free to reach out to me at sarabantahealth.com. I'm here to put together a protocol for you, and join my free group coaching on Telegram. There's no downside. I share daily tips and tools to improve your health. I answer your questions, and you will be surrounded by a community of people who are on a similar path. There's more information on my site, sarabantahealth.com. And of course, don't forget to follow me on social media at Accelerated Health Products. And you can catch this podcast on over 100 platforms, including Spotify, iTunes, and iHeartRadio. Just search Accelerated Health TV and Radio Show. I'm on a mission to share my healing message with everyone who's ready to listen. So please share this episode and help me with this goal with some friends who might benefit. And remember, I'm live every Monday and Tuesday and post a third one on Thursday. So make sure to subscribe, and you can visit my website and use coupon WELCOME10 to get 10% off your first order. Thanks again for joining us here, and have a great week.